So, Lone Rider here, and I wanted to talk about one of the nicer bikes I own, at least one of the nicer mass-produced ones. This is a Kona dawg, and it's a dual suspension mountain bike. Um, it's been described as an all mountain bike, but the truth is that um, I basically use it like it's a dual suspension XC bike, so it's maybe a little overbuilt for what I'm using it for, but that's perfectly fine because the truth is this is one of those bikes that it's it's really made in the spirit of mountain bikes as they were originally conceived, which was essentially a bike that can ride in a variety of conditions and for a variety of purposes, etc. Of course, nowadays everything is very specialized and everything is very narrowly defined, and you have all these niches. But originally, a mountain bike was just a mountain bike, and the one thing that this does really well is it handles pretty much anything you throw at it. So you've got a aluminum alloy, actually scandium alloy frame, butted tubing. You have your RockShox air shock. This has several settings, three actually. One is normal, where it goes up and down. One is a lockout position, where it's essentially rigid, so it turns it into, in effect, a hardtail. And the other one is I think it's called Pro Pedal, and it's like halfway between being locked out and rigid, so it limits the travel, but it does still have some travel. The fork is a Manitou, sort of a, I don't want to say generic fork. I mean, it's nothing special. It happened to come with the bike. This does have a lockout though. And then you have hydraulic disc brakes. These actually are giant NPH brakes, and they're fairly old. If you look at them, they're big and they're bulky. And this is, to be honest, the first and only bike I've ever had with hydraulics. I love how they feel, but I dread the idea of having to work on them. And most people I know, even people who either work at bike shops or even the owner of the local bike shop, really doesn't like to work on hydraulics. And most people that I've talked to, when their hydraulics break, they just replace them because a lot of times it's difficult to work on them. But I haven't had a problem with them so far. So the hydraulics came with the bike, as did the handlebar and the fork. Actually, pretty much as I got it, this is pretty much stock except for the bar stem and the tires. I put on these Continentals, Continental Gravities. They're what, like 2.3 inches, and the reason was it had fairly narrow tires on it. It had 1.9s, so 26 by 1.9s. And that was a little narrow for where I was riding, where there was a lot of rocks and roots and stuff. And so I put my own tires on there. Also, these have a little bit more tread. They get a little bit better traction. The other ones are kind of slippy. Now the gearing is pretty much unimpressive. This doesn't have anything fancy. You've got a standard triple in the front. And in the back, it's actually only 8-speed. So this is not what the bike would have come with originally. Now, I got this used from a coworker at my old job. He had decided he was going to part with it. And it's actually kind of funny. I knew about these for years. When I was young and somewhat thinner, the only dual suspension mountain bike I really thought was worthwhile having was the Specialized FSR. And I think a lot of people in my generation, that was the one they really looked up to. And of course, like many people at that age, in my teenage years, I was in college, I could not afford an FSR. The funny thing, of course, is that when you get older, stuff that was new and out of your reach becomes old and is sold as a used product, and you can afford it. Of course, if you wait long enough, it becomes vintage or antique, and then the value goes back up again. But I got my hands on an FSR variant before I had this, and it was sort of it was the all mountain version. So instead of the shock being up here, where it normally is on the FSR, it was down here. And I actually I love that bike. It was really cool. It was red and black, which of course is the colors of the local bike shop. And it was just a really neat all around bike. But there was a lot of pedal strike. It had a real low bottom bracket. And I remember that this was back when the no bike signs were taken down for about 8 months at Watchung when we were engaged in a 3-year effort to get mountain bike access there. Um, I remember riding up a hill through the forest of creepy dying pines, as I'll call it. There's a section of piney woods there, and there was a lot of overlapping roots and stuff, and it was essentially like riding upstairs. And a couple of times my foot actually got bent over the front of the pedal, and I thought I was going to break my toes. I was like, wow. So as much as I liked the bike, I really didn't like the pedal strike. And I did some research trying to figure out what was I doing wrong. I got it as a frame only. It didn't come with a fork. I put my own fork on it. So I was wondering, did I put on a fork that wasn't long enough? Did I lower the bike in some way? I couldn't figure it out. And then finally I realized, after doing some research, that particular model, that particular FSR variant, I don't know if it was the Doro or something. I don't remember exactly, but it was supposed to have a low bottom bracket because it was a racing bike. It was for people going fast, and a lower bottom bracket is more stable, but you have to be more careful on technical terrain. So I was like, oh, I don't know if that's for a recreational rider. I don't know if that's what I want. So I had been dreaming about an FSR for literally 2 decades, and when I finally got my hands on one, I was like, Now, the cross-country FSR probably would have served me fine, but that wasn't the one I had the opportunity to get. This bike presented itself, and I was like, oh, cool. So I was looking around for another dual suspension, and I said, you know what, the FSR ain't so great. Let me see if I can find something else. Maybe I'll sell the FSR. So I ended up getting this thing. And, I knew about these when I was a kid, but I was never into them. I never wanted one. The main reason was aesthetic. They're ugly. If you look at the back of this bike, it almost looks like the thigh on a grasshopper. It has a very, it doesn't look like if you're like me and you grew up in an era when most bikes were hardtails, most mountain bikes were hardtails, and suspension was just coming into its own, dual suspension. A lot of the dual suspension bikes did somewhat resemble hardtails. They didn't have any of these weird things sticking out the back. If there was a separate, a separate movable rear triangle, it had a lot more smoother look that was closer to the aesthetic of a normal, quote unquote, normal bike frame. So I always just thought these were flat out ugly, and because of that, I never really had an interest in them. And it's funny because, of course, performance has nothing to do with aesthetics. And we all have our own biases, what we think looks cool, what we think is visually pleasing. But at the end of the day, there's a certain functional aesthetic, something that's designed to work well is gonna be cool in its own way, even if it doesn't fit your predisposed ideas. Spyderco knives are a great example. I always used to think Spydercos, whether something short and stubby like this Spyderco Ambitious, or whether a more traditional, thinner design like the Spyderco Delica or Endura, I always used to think Spyderco pocket knives were ugly as sin. I thought they were kind of cool. I've always thought they were kind of cool ever since one appeared in the movie Cliffhanger in my youth. But I really thought they were kind of ugly. I liked a traditional looking pocket knife, like a Buck 110, a drop point. And then I actually tried one, and oh wow, it's really easy to open. That hole in the blade is one of the best, in my opinion, one of the best designs for opening a pocket knife. In fact, I would say, thus far in my experience, it's the best opening device for a one-handed pocket knife with the exception perhaps of a flipper on the back or some kind of a spring assist. So something like my Kershaw Knockout has a flipper, a thumb stud, and it's spring assisted. It's basically like a budget zero tolerance, except it has its own characteristics as well. It's a lot slimmer and lighter than most ZT knives, etc. But it uses the same speed safe assisted opening, and it's very similar in how it functions, if not its proportions. And that is one of the few knives that I'm comfortable operating with my right hand ever since I injured it. Spyderco is another. This is probably, in fact, the only non-flipper, non-assist knife that I can actually open with this hand anymore. So, as the function of the Spyderco pocket knife has shown me how functional it is, and my eyes have been open to that, I've grown in appreciation for the aesthetic. I also still appreciate a traditional-looking pocket knife. However, I have a new appreciation for the aesthetic of the Spyderco, and that's directly tied to its functionality. If it didn't work, it would still be ugly as sin. But because everything on this is there for a reason, to enable its function, it does have sort of a, let's say, a mechanical aesthetic that I do find pleasing now. But it had to grow on me. And it's the same thing with this bike. I still think it doesn't look like the bike that I thought I would want when I was, 19. But now that I've ridden it, and I've ridden it off-road, and I've ridden it in Lewis Morris, I rode it at Watchung, back when Watchung was, again, during that period when the signs were down and people were riding there. I've ridden it in other places, and it's just a really, really nice, well-balanced, well-handling bike. It's not so much that it's light. It's not as light as a hardtail, no, unless you get something made out of carbon fiber or maybe some kinds of titanium. No dual suspension bike really is going to be light as a hardtail. But it's not so much the amount of weight that there is as how it handles and how it's balanced. And this bike just rides really great. Another thing that is good about it is the way the suspension is designed. It is incredibly effective. When it's locked out, it's rigid as hell. It feels like a hardtail in terms of how rigid it is. But when you activate the suspension, it does its job wonderfully. It does exactly what it's supposed to. As somebody who is an avid cyclist and a mountain biker as well as a roadie, but not a hardcore mountain biker, I'm not doing any crazy stunts or anything. I just like riding around. But as somebody who is an avid cyclist, one of the assessments I've developed is that the thing about suspension is kind of like editing in movies. When it's really, really good is when you don't even notice it's there. And honestly, you forget that you're riding a bike with suspension. It just feels like you're riding a bike, and the ride happens to be a little smoother and a little more controllable. So, overall, I would say this is now an older design. This is not a bike that is top of the line anymore. I don't even remember when this one's from. I want to say 08. I might be wrong. It might be newer. It might be like 2012 or something. But this is not a brand new bike. This is not a... It's a bike that was very expensive when it was new, and it was one of the top tier. Not the top bike that they were making in that lineup, but it was near the top. So it was middle to top, and it really does handle nice. And everything about it, seems to have been done for a reason. And that's, like I said, it's not the aesthetic I was looking for. It's not the style of bike I was looking for. It's not the bike I thought that I would love, but I love it because it works. That's part of growing up. When I was 19, I was very influenced by what was in Bicycling magazine and what the cool guys were riding, and what the dudes that had sponsors in their jerseys, and Tomac and Missy Gio and Overend and all those people. And then you realize those guys are racing. What they're riding and the aesthetics that go with the functionality of that particular type of bike has no direct bearing on what I'm doing on a daily basis. That's not to say, if you can afford a top of the line race level bike that you probably wouldn't enjoy riding it, you probably would. But the point is, it may not be suited to what you're trying to do. And yeah, if I came across an XC version of the FSR and it rode as good as this, would I be interested in it? Yeah, because I still have sort of a soft spot for that bike. But the particular model of the FSR that I had, as cool as it was, the pedal strike was a deal killer for me. This bike rides 10 times better, in my opinion anyway. And again, this is a subjective opinion, but it's based on objective evidence on things that I've seen and observed in the real world. And in real world situations, not what you read about in Bicycling Magazine, not what you read about, in some review, but in what you experience when you're out on the trail and you're riding around, this bike blows that out of the water. So, there's a lot to be said for this. And, it's kind of funny. I've seen and ridden other bikes. Somebody I know had a Titus. I rode that. I've seen a lot of really other nice bikes. Cannondales with the lefty fork and other stuff. And the truth is that there are advantages to some of the newer designs. Like I said, this is no longer the newest and greatest, but it works. And so, if you're considering, hey, I want a mountain bike, I want, maybe something that's a little more durable, maybe has dual suspension, consider the used market and consider something like this. You can still find them. Again, I just bought this off an acquaintance, off a coworker at the time. But, you can still find these out there, and they'll probably ride as good, if not better, as any of the newer fangled designs that you'll see. Because the way this seems to have been put together, I haven't talked to the designer, obviously, or anything like that, but the way it seems to have been put together, as somebody who is a cyclist and has been for a long time, to me, it seems as if they based everything they did not on what was going to be cool or what it was going to look like, but on what they wanted it to do and how to go about accomplishing that. In other words, this wasn't designed by a marketing department. This wasn't designed to appeal to, people who like flashy pictures in magazines. To me, it seems, as somebody who rides this bike, that it was designed for the riders. And that's as it should be. So that's my Kona dawg. And again, I tweaked it a little bit. It came with the saddle. It came with the Thompson seat post. I had to put my own tires on there, put these little anodized things on there. I thought that was kind of cool. I did have to change the stem. It came with a much longer stem that really affected the handling. So I put a stem on it that was more appropriate for the bike. And I do want to throw in a caveat: if you buy a used bike of any kind, go over it mechanically and check all the parts. One of the things that I noticed the first day I had this bike, I just took it around the block a couple times. By the time I got home from work that day, it was dark. But I topped off the tires, I tested the brakes, and then I rode it around the block. And I felt like something was loose. What is wrong? Well, you'll notice this has disc brakes. The disc brake rotors are held on by a handful of bolts that bolt into the flange of the hub. On the rear wheel, there was only a single bolt holding on the disc brake rotor. All the other bolts were missing. The fittings here that bolt on to hold these cables, they were loose, they were rattling. There was not a single dab of grease in the seat post or on the binder bolt. And the grips were put on. These are locking grips, so they have a clamp here and a clamp here. But the way they were put on, the clamp on the end was sticking out over the end of the bar, so it wasn't grabbing on anything. And I actually had that turn in my hand. So the previous owner, I don't think this was on purpose. I don't think he knew the condition of the bike. Maybe he hadn't ridden it in a few years. But the point is, the previous owner either never finished putting it together, or it was just, done poorly. And, if you're going to be riding on the bike, you're basically responsible for your safety. So go over it, make sure nothing's busted, missing, loose, whatever. And if I had not figured that out when I was just riding around the block in front of my house, if I had waited until I was out in the woods on a mountain bike trail, who knows what could have happened. I could have been injured. Somebody else could have been injured. The bike could have been destroyed in a crash, whatever. So um, I will say, you can find a used one of these. If you find one, it's probably going to be one of the best mountain bikes you'll ever have if you're into this kind of thing. Um, but if you do get a used bike of any kind, go over it mechanically and make sure it's safe before you ride it, because not everybody knows what they're doing and not everybody bothers to do it right. And that doesn't include, by the way, home, do-it-yourself people and garage mechanics and bike owners. It also, in some cases, includes some shops. Not every shop does a good assembly. So just throwing that out there. But yeah, if you can find one of these Kona dawg bikes, this is my favorite. Well, my single speed obviously is my favorite mountain bike, but this is a very close second. This is definitely my favorite dual suspension mountain bike I've ever ridden or owned or experienced. So, and I think there's a reason for that. They just did it right. Lone Rider out.